Okay, imagine this. You're walking through a really busy park, right? Kids running around, dogs chasing balls, people everywhere, and somehow you just glide through it all. You anticipate where people are going, you sidestep, maybe you even catch a frisbee someone throws your way, all without consciously, calculating physics problems in your head. Or think about driving on a highway. You change lanes, judge distances, react to brake lights sometimes, while your mind is totally elsewhere, maybe even listening to us right now. You're not solving equations. Or even simpler, you reach for your coffee cup. Your hand just knows where it is, how far to go, how to grab the handle, how do we do all that? How do we understand our own movement or when things are coming towards us, or just the layout of a room without thinking about it? Right, let's try to unpack this a bit, because for centuries, the main idea about perception was that our senses are kind of passive. They just collect these little bits of information, these fleeting sensations, light, sound, whatever. And then our brain has to do all this heavy lifting. Yeah, like piecing together a puzzle from random, constantly changing fragments to build a stable picture of reality. But what if that whole starting point, that basic assumption, was just wrong? A fiction, as one really revolutionary thinker called it. What if the information wasn't fragmented at all? So today we're doing a deep dive into the work of James Gibson, specifically his really key concept of optic flow. Gibson came up with something he called ecological optics. It's this rigorous scientific way of looking at perception that's not just about the mind, but it's also not just about the nerves and eyeballs either. He laid it all out in his big book, The Senses, considered as perceptual systems. And our mission today is to explore how Gibson basically challenged everything people thought they knew. He argued the information out there in the environment is way richer and more direct than anyone had realized. And we'll see how optic flow is absolutely central to this whole new way of thinking. You'll really get a sense of how just moving through the world actively shapes what you perceive. Okay, so here's where it starts to get, kind of wild when you first think about it. Your eyes, right? They're never perfectly still. Little movements all the time. Plus, your head turns, your body moves, you walk, you lean. And as all this happens, the light hitting your retinas is constantly changing. It's in flux. Gibson called this input variable and changing in the extreme. So if the raw data coming in is this chaotic shifting mess, how on earth do you perceive a stable world? How do you know that coffee cup isn't shape-shifting as you reach for it? That's the fundamental puzzle.
Exactly. That's the big problem, the constancy problem that traditional ideas really struggled with. I mean, people had been wrestling with this for ages. You had figures like Johannes Miller back in 1838 suggesting that what we actually perceive is just, the state of our nerves changing. And then our mind, our imagination, interprets those nerve changes as objects out there. A two-step thing. Sensation, then interpretation. Then later, Hermann von Helmholtz, a huge name in the field around 1867, he talked about how we imagine objects being there based on how they would affect our nerves. So both of them, in different ways, imply that the brain is actively constructing reality, like building it from scratch, based on these really basic, maybe even ambiguous sensory signals, like guessing what's out there.
Right, like the brain is this internal artist painting a picture based on coded messages. And that led to this widespread idea, the receptor mosaic doctrine.
Mm-hmm.
The idea was basically that you have these excited points on your senses, like pixels on your retina, and this pattern gets sent to the brain, like an image. And the brain then somehow looks at this internal image. But Gibson just tore that idea apart. He said, look, for an organism that's actually moving, exploring, this static anatomical projection, this retinal image, is quite simply irrelevant for the process of normal perception.
Mm.
It's like neurophysiologists knew loads about eye anatomy, lenses, retinas, that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe not so much about the actual act of looking, listening, touching in the real world. They studied sensation in immobilized people, not perception in active beings. That's a huge difference.
And Gibson's alternative was, truly radical. He flipped the whole thing. Instead of a passive organism just getting hit by stimuli, he argued the environment provides stimulus information, not just raw energy like light waves, but structured information. This distinction is absolutely key. Stimulus energy is just, say, light intensity. Stimulus information is what that pattern of light specifies about the world, like the edge of a table or how far away something is. He also made a distinction between available stimuli, the energy that's out there, and an effective one. To be effective, you need an active observer using their senses to pick it up. He really pushed back against the idea of a stimulus as just a goad or sting hitting a passive creature. He said, no, organisms obtain stimuli through their own activity, through exploring. Being active is fundamental.
Okay, so let's bring this down to earth. What does this really mean for you listening right now? How does this change how we think about just seeing stuff? Gibson was saying the big question isn't how do we connect these random sensory dots to make a picture? It's not about assembling a jigsaw puzzle in the dark. Instead, the question is how the sound, the odor, the warmth, or the light that specifies fire gets discriminated from all the other sounds, odors, warmths, and lights that do not specify fire. It shifts the focus completely. The meaning, the information is already in the stimulus. It's in the light, the sound waves, the chemical molecules. Our perceptual systems are tuned to pick up that meaning directly. The brain doesn't create it, it detects it. That's a massive shift, isn't it?
It absolutely is. And Gibson had already started laying the groundwork for this earlier in his 1950 book, The Perception of the Visual World. He argued even then that the sensory information is rich and quite sufficient, unquote. A really important part of this was recognizing that the natural world isn't made of isolated points or lines floating in empty space, which is often how early experiments presented things. No, he said, the world is made of continuous surfaces, walls, floors, the ground, objects. Everything has surfaces. And focusing on surfaces led him to the idea of gradients. Gradients are these systematic, lawful changes in the patterns of light reaching your eyes, what he called the optic array. These changes directly tell you about the structure of the world. Think of them like continuous patterns, not separate bits. He talked about size gradients, texture gradients, motion gradients, stuff like that.
Okay, like texture gradients.
So,
What's an example?
Right. Imagine you're looking down a pebbly beach, or maybe a long field with rows of crops. The pebbles or rows right near you look big, spaced out, distinct. But as you look further away, they appear to get smaller and smaller, packed tighter together, until they kind of blend into a uniform texture in the distance. That systematic change, that's the texture gradient. And it directly tells your visual system about the slant of the ground and how far away different parts are. You don't need to calculate it consciously. The information is just there in the gradient pattern itself. And the critical thing here is that these gradients aren't random. They're consequences of geometry, pure physics. Like basic geometry tells us Euclid's law, essentially, that if something is twice as far away, it takes up half the angle in your vision. It looks half as big.
Right, like distant mountains looking small.
Exactly. That relationship between size and distance is baked into the light itself. It's like the light carries its own measuring stick. So the information is objectively available in the light patterns for any visual system to potentially use. Any animal with eyes could, in theory, use this. It's about what the system could use, not necessarily what a person is consciously aware of or can put into words. The info is just out there.
That distinction is so important, isn't it? It really flips the script. The information isn't manufactured in our heads. It's objectively out there in the world, structured in the light, waiting for us to actively pick it up. Our brains aren't constructors, they're detectors. Okay, but this sounds very static. Gradients on a beach, fields. What happens when things move? When we move? Because that feels like where the real action is, perception-wise. And that's where optic flow comes in, right? This seems like Gibson's knockout punch. Yeah, let's dive right into the core of it, optic flow. So what is it exactly? In simple terms, it's the patterns of motion in the optic array, that structured light hitting your eyes. And these patterns are caused by movement, either you moving or objects moving, or both happening at once. Just think about it. Every tiny head movement, every step you take, every car driving past it all creates specific, continuous, lawful changes in the light patterns reaching your retina. That dynamic, flowing, streaming pattern is optic flow. It's like the visual world is constantly washing over you, and that flow carries information.
Precisely. Gibson's genius was realizing just how fundamental this is. We are constantly moving around in our environment, even if it's just shifting our gaze slightly. And these movements aren't noise that the brain has to filter out. They actively create lawful changes in the patterns of light reaching our eyes. This was a huge break from the past. Most perception research before the 1950s used static pictures, maybe flashed really quickly with things called tachistoscopes.
Right, like for milliseconds.
So, yeah, studying perception in this very artificial, frozen way, totally detached from how we actually experience the world dynamically. Gibson said, no, movement is where the information is. And optic flow is so significant for a few key reasons. First, it's another powerful example of the sheer richness of the available sensory information. It shows how the world's structure and layout are specified, especially during movement. It captures that dynamic dance between you and your surroundings. Your actions reveal information. Second, it really did revolutionize how experimental psychology studied perception. People started moving away from static dots and lines towards dynamic displays. I remember seeing early demos, like from Mike Bronstein, using 16mm films to show structure from motion, just moving dots, creating this incredibly strong sense of a 3D object rotating.
Wow, like a precursor to modern CGI and stuff.
Absolutely, all flowing from understanding optic flow. It pushed researchers to study perception in motion. And third, maybe the most fundamental point. Optic flow became the foundation for Gibson's distinction between the optic array and the retinal image. This is where he really took aim at the old way of thinking. He totally rejected the idea of the retinal image as being like a picture inside your eye. He thought Isaac Newton's idea that objects are painted on the back of the eye was seriously misleading.
Why misleading?
Because, he argued, it leads to this insoluble paradox of an infinite series of nested individuals.
The homunculus problem, right.
The little man in the brain.
Exactly. If there's a picture on the retina who's looking at it, a little man inside, but then that little man must have eyes and a brain with another picture.
And another little man inside him. Forever.
Right. An absurd infinite regress. He called it a sensationless perception problem. It just doesn't work philosophically. It's a dead end. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So the eye isn't a camera feeding pictures to an internal audience. That whole metaphor is busted. Perception isn't about interpreting an internal image. It's about information about objects entering the eye directly. The visual system detects differences, patterns, and crucially, changes in the light. And that's enough. No need for a little guy interpreting things. Our brains are tuned to the structure of the light itself, especially the flow. It simplifies everything.
And to make this concrete, Gibson drew these now iconic diagrams of optic flow. They really help visualize it. One shows the outflow pattern you'd see if you were, say, in an aircraft approaching a runway. All the points on the ground seem to stream outwards from one central point ahead, the point you're heading towards.
The focus of expansion.
Exactly. And that pattern, projected onto a flat 2D surface in his diagram, clearly specifies your direction of travel. Another famous diagram shows the flow like a bird flying over a plowed field, but this time projected onto a sphere, more like our actual panoramic visual field. The geometry is slightly different on a sphere. Visual displacements relate directly to angular size, letting you compare sizes and speeds across the whole view. It's arguably a richer representation. Gibson noted there's no good reason for preferring one representation over the other, universally, but sometimes people have gotten the characteristics confused, which can muddy the waters a bit. But connecting this back, these diagrams weren't just sketches. They were a powerful way to show how the world's complex structure gets mapped into the structure of the array at all levels of angular size. They showed how every single form, even the smallest pebble or detail, undergoes a transformation in that light pattern as you move. And crucially, that transformation, that dynamic flow, is the information. It carries the meaning about the world and your movement within it. The flow tells you where you're going, how fast, the layout of surfaces. It's an incredibly elegant solution.
It really is elegant. And, this makes me wonder about something we often see in science history. When someone like Gibson has this huge transformative idea, was he really working in a vacuum? Or were other people perhaps thinking along similar lines, maybe tackling related problems? Knowing the history is so useful, right? It makes you think about alternatives, different angles, and it puts the ideas in the context of the time, the problems people were actually trying to solve.
That's such an important point, because while Gibson's 1950 book is usually seen as the birth of optic flow in psychology, we have to acknowledge there were several other developments of this concept. People like Guillaume Grinley and Edward Calvert were definitely working on very similar ideas around the same time, maybe even a bit earlier in some respects. And even before them, back in 1949, someone named Kalmus did fascinating work on flies. He explicitly broke down their visual motion perception into rotation and translation components.
On flies?
Yeah. He studied their optomotor responses, how they automatically turn or walk in response to visual motion. He found they turn with rotation but walk opposite to translation, that fundamental distinction. It's standard practice now when studying self-motion perception, so the idea of analyzing flow components was definitely in the air.
And the context you mentioned, the problems people were trying to solve. World War II seems absolutely critical here, doesn't it? Gibson was working for the Army Air Force. Grindley was with the RAF's Flying Personnel Research Committee. They were both dealing with urgent, practical aviation problems, landing planes especially.
Exactly. Gibson himself said he had this stark realization that existing psychology theories offered nothing of any practical value about the perception of motion or of locomotion in space. The classical theories just couldn't explain how pilots did what they did.
It's incredible, isn't it? Birds and bees managed just fine, navigating complex environments. But our best psychological theories couldn't explain how trained pilots landed multi-ton machines. Pilots were doing it, but maybe despite the official understanding, not because of it. It really shows how real-world problems can force scientists to look at things completely differently.
Absolutely. Grindley's work from 1942 is a perfect example. He was laser-focused on how experienced pilots judge their height above the ground during that critical landing phase. He came up with this idea of the apparent movement of objects in the visual field, which is essentially optic flow. His key insight was this. When you're descending at a constant angle, the spot on the ground you're heading towards stays stationary in your view, the 0 point, or focus of expansion. But everything else seems to spread out radially from that point, like the ground is streaming outwards.
Okay, I can picture that.
And here's the crucial bit. Grindley figured out that the speed of that outward streaming increases as the aeroplane descends. And even better, the speed is inversely proportional to the airplane's height. So the pattern of flow directly tells the pilot their height and angle of descent. It's right there in the visual information. His experiments showed people got really good at judging this, down to like 5% error after a few days, even though they tended to overestimate speed at first. It was practical perception in action. And then you have Edward Calvert, around 1950, doing this really detailed geometrical analysis of the whole landing process. He talked about how all the visual streamers, the lines of flow, seem to pass through point X, the intended touchdown point. He described how a pilot could literally steer by keeping those streamers flowing steadily and symmetrically past that point. A direct perceptual control strategy. And he also noted how the rate at which those streamer velocities increase signals the rate of descent that's related to the phenomenon of looming, when something expands rapidly as it gets closer.
Right, like a ball flying towards your face.
Exactly. Calvert even worked out the math for retinal velocity for any approach angle. Really detailed stuff. But, history is nuanced. Dietrich Niehorster, who wrote A History of Optic Flow, raises an interesting point. He argues that while Grindley and Calvert's work was significant, maybe they didn't fully grasp the fundamental importance of that expanding pattern for perceiving your own direction of motion in the way Gibson did. Niehorster suggests Gibson's core ground theory, focusing on those gradients of speed across surfaces, wasn't directly derived from Grindley's report. It was more Gibson's own radical leap.
So, describing the phenomenon versus understanding its deep perceptual meaning.
Kind of. Gibson's big move was saying we directly perceive higher order things, like our own motion, from these complex patterns, really challenging the whole sensation-based view. It was a deeper theoretical shift. And even the terminology is interesting. We often talk about heading your direction of self-motion. Many people associate that term with Gibson. But actually, while Gibson talked a lot about direction of locomotion, the term heading was popularized later by William Warren in 1988, just as a convenient shorthand. Calvert did use track heading sometimes, but Gibson mostly stuck to longer phrases. It just shows how language evolves in science as ideas get refined.
That's fascinating. It really paints a picture of science as this evolving conversation, doesn't it? Independent discoveries, maybe some cross-pollination, and language changing to keep up. But let's get back to the power of optic flow itself. What exactly does it tell us about the world around us? How does it make our perception work so well?
Well, Gibson showed that even quite simple transformations in the optic array, just regular, ordered changes in the light pattern, allow us to perceive motion. It's not like random flickering like old TV snow. It's a pattern that changes in a regular order, and that order carries meaning.
Meaning about what?
Meaning about events happening in the world. Gibson used wonderful examples. He said things like, the flutter of a leaf, the fall of an acorn, the twitching of a tail, and the lifting of a man's eyebrow are specified in the flux. The specific way the light pattern changes tells you exactly what kind of event is occurring, even subtle things. He also noted how a peculiar rippling of light specifies a surface of water. You see that shimmering flow, you know it's water, even without seeing the water itself clearly. The core point is, the ambient array with transformation carries more information than the same array without transformation. Motion reveals more. The form of motion often specifies more than the form as such. The dynamics are key.
So this constant flow isn't just noise, it's packed with information. And you mentioned redundancy earlier. How does that make our perception so robust? It seems like we can handle imperfect views pretty well.
Absolutely. Gibson argued that the natural optic array carries much more information than anyone is ever likely to pick up. There's an abundance of information out there. And because of this richness, much of it can be sacrificed without completely wrecking our perception.
Sacrificed how?
Think about looking through a picket fence or Venetian blinds, or even looking at a newspaper photo, which is just dots with gaps between them.
Right, you still see the scene behind the fence or the image in the photo?
Exactly. Those small gaps in the information don't usually affect perception much because the information is highly redundant. There are multiple overlapping cues telling you the same thing about the world. The overall pattern persists. This redundancy is why perception isn't fragile. It's robust. The Gestalt psychologist showed this too. You only really lose the information if the gaps happen in very specific, critical places, not just anywhere. And it also explains what happens in situations of deficient perception. Think about being in really dense fog or trying to see in almost total darkness.
Yeah, you can barely make anything out.
Right. The information is inadequate. And what does your perceptual system do? It hunts. You squint, you turn your head, you try to move to get a better angle. Exploratory attention persists as you actively try to make sense from what little information you can get. Your system is desperately seeking that meaningful pattern. And optic flow doesn't just tell us about movement, it specifies the static structure too, but revealed through movement. For instance, the slant of a surface in the room is specified by the continuous gradient of flow velocities of its optical texture. If you move your head while looking at a textured wall, the way the texture flows faster or slower at different points tells you how slanted it is. And an edge of a surface, like a tabletop, is specified by a sudden discontinuity in the flow. The flow pattern abruptly breaks or changes direction at the edge. A corner is an even more complex discontinuity.
So the edges and shapes pop out because of how the flow breaks.
Precisely. Gibson talked about texture being wiped or sheared at an edge. One flow pattern gets cut off by another. That visual event directly corresponds to a separation of surfaces in the world. This idea also neatly explains occlusion, one thing disappearing behind another. The visual event, the transformation, where one texture stream gets wiped out by another moving across it, directly specifies that one surface is now in front of the other. It even helps make sense of things like Michat's tunnel effect. Remember that? Where an object goes into a tunnel on screen and pops out the other side.
Yeah, and people feel like they see it inside the tunnel, even though it's not actually visible.
Exactly. Traditional theories struggle with that sensationless perception. But Gibson would say, no, the stimulus information for the object's continued existence is still there in the continuous transformation, in the way the object disappears and reappears predictably. The flow specifies continuity. Sense data, or lack thereof, is irrelevant. And all this leads back to another really profound Gibsonian idea. That our senses, our perceptual systems, aren't just passive receivers. They correspond to the organs of active attention. They're dynamic systems that actively orient themselves for the pickup of environmental information. They're explorers.
Organs of active attention. I like that.
Think about it. Head movements, ear movements, hand movements, nose and mouth movements, and eye movements are part and parcel of the perceptual systems they serve. When you turn your head to hear better, run your fingers over something to feel its texture, sniff the air, or scan a scene with your eyes, these aren't separate from perception. They are perception in action. They are modes of attention, ways we actively engage to gather the information we need.
That makes total sense. Our bodies are constantly probing and sampling the world. But if the world is just packed with all this information and our systems are built to pick it up, does that mean we're all equally good at perceiving? Or can we actually get better at it? Not by making our brains smarter in the usual sense, but by getting better at using this information.
That's a fantastic question, and Gibson had a fascinating answer. He argued that, yes, perception absolutely improves with experience, potentially to an unlimited extent, if the available information is rich enough. Our senses are not fixed-capacity instruments like cameras and microphones. They don't just max out. Instead, looking and listening continue to improve with experience. We can learn to detect more subtle patterns, higher-order variables, even as we get older. It's not a fixed skill. And this improvement isn't necessarily about memorizing things or forming associations in the traditional learning sense. It's more about an attunement of a complex system to the meaningful invariance in the environment, the stable patterns that specify things. Gibson called this the education of attention. It's about learning what to look for, what to listen for, what to feel for. The observer learns to look for the critical features, to listen for the distinctive variations. Think of a wine expert learning to taste subtle differences, or a musician learning to hear tiny variations in pitch or timbre, or someone learning to identify bird calls.
Or feeling the difference between wool and silk just by touch.
Exactly. It's learning to detect the specifying information. You become more sensitive to the distinctions that matter. He even reinterpreted classical conditioning, like Pavlov's dog. From a Gibsonian view, the dog isn't just forming an arbitrary link between a bell and food. Instead, the dog is learning to detect the bell-food invariant in its specific situation. It's learning that the bell reliably predicts food in this context. It's attuning to a meaningful regularity in its world.
So learning is about becoming better attuned to the information that's already there.
That's a great way to put it. It's refining your perceptual systems to pick up more and more subtle information directly. And it's crucial to see that these principles aren't just about vision and optic flow. Gibson saw them applying across all sensory systems. Take the haptic system, our sense of active touch, body position, movement. It includes skin sensations, exploring things with our hands, feeling weight and resistance dynamically, sensing temperature, feeling orientation. This system lets us perceive shape, size, texture, solidity, all without vision. Think of a sculptor feeling the foam of their clay, or a mechanic identifying a part by feel in a dark engine day, or even just navigating a dark room by touching walls. It's incredibly rich. And Gibson also highlighted social touch. Think of the importance of touch in bonding, communication, reassurance, a necessary basis of social life. Or the auditory system. Meaningful sounds aren't just noises, they are complex patterns, higher order variables that are specific to the source. The unique sound of wind in pines is different from wind in deciduous trees. The sound of running water tells you about the flow rate in the environment. An animal's cry specifies the animal and maybe its emotional state. And think about auditory self-stimulation. Listening to ourselves speak allows for incredibly fine control over articulation.
Like the delayed feedback thing you mentioned.
Exactly. The delayed auditory feedback experiment, where hearing your own voice slightly delayed completely messes up your speech, shows how crucial that real-time auditory flow is for controlling the action of speaking. We monitor the acoustic flow we produce, and even smell the olfactory system. Gibson argued we don't just detect chemicals passively, we detect chemical values or affordances. Oh, does a smell specify something edible or poisonous, ripe or rotten, friend or foe, prey or predator? It's about detecting the biologically or socially significant meaning carried by the chemicals. The system picks up on the important differences for that individual. Sure, a chemist can discriminate far more compounds, but a police dog is exquisitely tuned to discriminate human scents, and a perfume expert or a chef is tuned to discriminate complex aromatic profiles that specify quality or origin. It's about attunement to meaningful information again.
Wow. So as we kind of wrap things up here, let's just quickly recap this whole journey. J.J. Gibson's work, especially focusing on things like environmental gradients and, crucially, optic flow, just completely turned our understanding of perception inside out. He really moved us away from this idea of a passive brain stuck inside the skull, trying to guess what's happening based on fragmented clues, towards this powerful picture of an active organism directly picking up rich, meaningful information from a dynamic world. It's about detecting, not constructing. So maybe the next time you're just walking around, driving, even just looking around your room, and take a second, try to notice that flow, that constant stream of visual change happening as you move. And think about what this understanding of optic flow tells you about your own amazing built-in ability to navigate, to learn, to adapt, all flowing naturally from your interaction with the environment, often without you consciously directing it at all.
And it really makes you wonder, doesn't it, if our perception naturally gets sharper through this education of attention, learning to pick up these subtle invariants. What could we achieve if we design technology differently? Instead of just mimicking old camera and screen models, what if we created virtual reality or autonomous robots or training simulators that truly tapped into these natural principles of optic flow and active perception?
Yeah, imagine VR that felt truly embodied because it perfectly matched your movements with the right visual flow.
Or robots that navigated complex spaces as fluidly as animals do. The potential for more intuitive interfaces, better training, maybe even just richer experiences of the world seems huge, doesn't it, if we really leverage how perception actually works?
Absolutely. So we invite you, our listeners, to become observers of your own perception. Notice the optic flow as you move today. See how that dynamic pattern guides you, informs you, connects you directly to the world, all without needing that imaginary little person in your head. It's all right there in the flow.